are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Butler from Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar presentation, Battered African American Women, an Examination of Gender Entrapment. I'll introduce our presenter, Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, in just a moment, but first I want to go over a few technical informational bits with you. First of all, you should be able to hear me, and you should see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the volume, I suggest you make sure your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar and return to the link in your email and then reconnect. We welcome your questions throughout the presentation. You can submit them using the question box, and those will come to me. I will hold on to them until the last 15 minutes or so after the presentation, and we'll take as many questions as we can at that time. And the slides you see on your screen during the presentation will be sent to you as a PDF this afternoon, so you will have them for your reference. You don't have to worry about taking extensive notes. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who are not available to attend the live presentation. So we welcome those who may be listening to the recording. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. They're a wonderful partner, and they have sponsored dozens of webinars in the past, including a series of 12 this year as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. You can find recordings of many of those webinars on our website, and you can find out more about their great work at infaithfound.org. They're really a wonderful sponsor, so we thank them. Today's presenter is Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, and we're delighted to have her with us. She is a pastor, a professor, and a former police officer. For 15 years, she served as a pastoral care provider for the Evergreen Park Ministries Care and Counseling Center. She was also the director of the Center for African American Ministries and Black Church Studies at McCormick Theological Seminary. Sharon was a Chicago police officer for over 31 years as a patrol officer, a criminalist in the crime lab, and a police chaplain, ministering to police officers and members of their families, especially during times of crisis. She's a retired board-certified chaplain, as well as a nationally recognized speaker and workshop leader in the field of domestic violence, pastoral care, and ethics. And she has recently published a book, African American Battered Women, A Study in Gender Entrapment, which is the basis for today's webinar. So I'm sure that you'll be fascinated to hear about what she's been working on for the last decade. Sharon, I'm going to turn this over to you, and audience members, please remember you can send questions to us at any point during the presentation.
Great. Hello, everyone. And first, let me say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and join with me and have this discussion on issues of gender entrapment. I am so excited about this study. It's something that I've been working on for many years, and I wanted to publish it, and it did get published as a book, as you see right in front of you. But I also wanted it to be a piece where we continue the conversation, because the work still is not done. And so what I'm presenting to you today is a sample of the research in which I did to come to the place where I thought we needed to talk about gender entrapment when we're working with victims and abusers. And so that's where we'll begin today. But I wanted to kind of start off this time together with assertion that I'm making that grounds everything that I'm talking about today. And that assertion is that African American liberation theology can be used as a basis to break the gender entrapment of African American battered women. To get started and tell you a piece of my story as a survivor of sexual and domestic violence, I began working in maybe the late 80s as an advocate for victims of domestic violence. I began working in shelters, completed the 40-hour training, and really this was my life's work as a survivor, not called to this, but compelled to come and talk about issues of sexual and domestic violence. And so while I was doing this work in the late 80s and early 90s, I began to to have to experience a plethora of questions coming from my white counterparts around issues of why more African American women were not involved in this movement against sexual and domestic violence, and especially with domestic violence. And I really at that time didn't have any real answers. I knew why I was there, but I didn't have any really real answers to offer them. But I began to reflect on this question and think about this question and ponder this question. And also, as I began to work with victims of domestic violence, it became clearer and clearer to me that there were at least 3 issues, there may be more, but 3 that I identified that were important in answering this question. First, in my experience, I began to realize that the standard advocacy model for domestic violence was too heavily focused on the criminal justice system and not as a means of settling the issue of domestic violence. That the criminal justice system was an intricate part of the work that needed to be done, and that African American men, as a result of the Domestic Violence Act and domestic violence being criminalized, were being committed to penal institutions and developing records. And the second piece that began to come forward for me is that the standard, if any of you have ever taken domestic violence courses, there's a standard power and control will, and there are different tactics that abusers use with victims in domestic violence. However, in the middle of that power and control will, it's the sign power and control that lets us know at the center of all abusive behavior is the need for power and control. And this has never changed. It continues to be that way today. However, as I reflected on the power and control will, I realized that this was not really working well for African American battered women, who at that time that were being forced to go to batterist groups to talk about issues of battering were being guided by white men. And there was white men telling African American men about their sense of power. And so this wasn't connecting in terms of why are you telling me, why is this person who certainly is themselves a source of power and control in the lives of African American telling me? And so that wasn't a healthy part. And then the third thing that I began to realize is that domestic violence in African American communities is not the prima facie issue within our community. In other words, domestic violence is not what is up front in our community. What is and always has been up front, and what should be up front, is the issue of racism within our community. And so that has been the focus of many of our advocacies, of marches that we've had and protests that we had. And so what happened with this whole issue of racism is that it was not fully articulated in ways in which the experiences of women and violence against women was happening. And so then as we look at African American liberation theology, really the stories and the impact of racism and violence was not really part of the story for African American women. It was not really considered. It was more focused on African American men, African American male empowerment, in the church, African American leadership, within our social movements, African American victimizations, i.e. the prison rate of African American men, the violence that happened to African American men within society. And so thus, when we began to look at ways in which we can intervene, the lesson became, let us find ways to empower men in the midst of all the racism that we're going through. And the issue around violence against women never got included in that conversation. And so consequently, at the same time, women were still going to the African American church to seek solace, to seek protection, to begin to have their story told. But in the midst of this, because this issue was not dealt with openly, and racism was against men, women began to be blamed and shamed. And much of the doctrinal and theological issues and Christological issues that were happening within our African American church really began to support the empowerment of men, and unfortunately to the subordination of African American women. One of the things that I did when I began this research is I went to talk to many pastors within African American churches. And so early in 2000, I spoke with one of the African American pastors at a pretty large church in the Chicago area. And I told him about this. I told him about violence against women, that women are not really empowered within the church, and that there's something that needs to be done. And what this man said to me is what I've heard over and over from many male pastors. And that is that their agenda within the church, because of racism, because of the oppression of African American men, their agenda is to empower African American men. And I says, well, what about empowering both African American men and African American women? And what came from that was, I will empower African American men, even if it means subordination and disempowerment of African American women, because that is the agenda. And so thus, women have, in the midst of that, been co-opted, that have been a part of this agenda themselves. We have, we were for it. Back in the 60s, I was right there advocating against racism. But in the midst of advocating against racism, I was not advocating for me as an African American female, but I got caught up in, we have to protect black men, we have to support black men, we have to do all of these things to make sure that the system is no longer going to criminalize and oppress African American men. And for me, that is what led up to the whole issue of gender entrapment. And we can go to the next slide as we look at the definition of gender entrapment. You read there, it is a socially constructed process through which women have been seduced or co-opted to adopt sets of gender and racial identities, principles, and concepts that have made them vulnerable to male emotional and physical violence. And all that is saying is that we have been co-opted, seduced, and given the agenda of male protection in such ways that it left us as females, as African American females, vulnerable to violence. Now, when I first came in touch with the word gender entrapment, it was through one of my mentors, who's a sociologist at the University of Illinois, and she first introduced me to that term in a book that she wrote called Compelled to Crime: The Gender Entrapment of Battered Black Women. And in this book, she was actually talking about gender entrapment for the sense of the criminal justice system, and how we have been, as women, lured into criminal activity. That many of the women she found in her study were in jail, because she studied the women that were in Rikers Island. And many of the African American women, not like many of the white women that were in there, many of the black women that were in Rikers Island were somehow connected to African American men and the crimes that they committed. And so she looked at that study, and she saw that there were many things that lured African American women into this criminal behavior. And a lot of that is around the issue of supporting African American men in criminal endeavor. It's being lured into relationships also that leaves women vulnerable to intimate partner violence, and subsequently blamed within the criminal justice system for how they got co-opted into working with African American men in these crimes. And so that's where I got this whole notion. When I read this book, I'm like, it was this big aha experience, something that I intuitively understood and I intuitively knew from the work that I was doing, from the personal experiences that I was having, that there's something that's going on here with African American battered women that needed to be named. Dr. Beth Ritchie named that for me. And so my work that I began to do in gender entrapment was as it related to the African American church. Unlike her, that Dr. Beth Ritchie, she was working with this around the issue of the criminal justice system, but found some of the same kinds of issues that go with gender entrapment. I wanted us to understand this in a faith-based way, how it has also impacted us. And so I was thankful that it gave me language to begin to talk about this, to begin to look at how we as the Black church has fostered this kind of vulnerability for women within our preaching, within our teaching. And when I talk about the Black church, I'm also talking about Black families. I'm also talking about culture, because we are more than just the actual church that we go to. We are in essence a great part in our families. We have church, and we have different churches. We have the Pentecostal church, the Church of God in Christ, the Baptist. We have all kind of church in our homes. We have church in the street. We have church in our jobs. So when I say Black church, I mean the whole plethora of ways we have been constructed genderly and racially that interprets women being vulnerable to this kind of violence. And so as we go to the next slide, that's where I said that we need to begin to look at the areas where this whole interlocking system of oppression, and that's what we call it. One of the things that we have to realize that when we're talking about issues of domestic violence, and if we're going to begin to tell the story of African American women, then we have to begin to look at how these things begin to interlock in our systems of oppression. And so this is where I began talking earlier, that when we look at the issue of race, then we have to understand how race has been constructed within our community and within our system. And that construction has been, again, about what has happened to the male in the midst of that. And I don't want to underscore that is a very important issue. It is a very important issue because I certainly believe that the destruction of African American families can begin with African American men. What I am saying in the midst of that is that we did that to the detriment of African American women's stories and inclusion into this whole conversation. And then you have the issue of class and how class intersects, because we understand as we look at class issues that the people who are in jail, who are in prison systems, are not rich white people, maybe not even rich Black people, but they are people who are probably poor to lower middle class people who don't have an income, who have to go to these private institutions. And in the midst of going to these institutions, these institutions are the ones that have mandatory reporting. And so what happens, it not only becomes a race issue, we got to deal with issues of race and what are we doing to harm another African American man. We have to deal with the issue of class. We deal with that in ways of understanding that the people that are going to get to jail are going to be African American men, mostly that hang out on the streets, mostly that where the women have to go to the hospitals. And so the mass incarceration, the incarceration rate that we talk about is all about the oppression of African American men. And if we go and try to effect an arrest around our domestic violence, and who are we hurting? We're hurting African American men. And so then the other issue of gender in terms of how that interlocks is that we're not really given our own story, because we have been, just like race is constructed, gender is constructed. It's constructed in a way that we have been given certain roles as a gender person. And within that role, we are very supportive. One of the words that we've used in some of the old church is standing in the gap for men. That part of our role is to stand in the gap. There are theologies out there that talk about that women are, from the scriptures in the Bible, that women are made to praise man, and then man is made to glorify God. And so our job is to hold that male up. And so these things have gotten particularized, the woman's place in the home. And I remember I'm a song person. Those who know me know that I'm a song person. And the whole issue of I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never ever let you forget you a man because I'm a woman. And that is part of what we've been told, that women have to be the superwoman, this everything, the supporter. And so in the midst of all of these interlocking systems of oppression, how is it that we can ever, if we ever get to the point where we can actually report crimes against ourselves, is almost a miracle. Because these issues are just back and forth, they're fluid, and they come up in our minds, whether they're conscious or unconscious, they're floating through our minds because we don't want to hurt African American men. Why? Because the agenda is to empower them, not to disempower them, and that is even at the expense of our own injuries. And so that's how we get there. And so let's look at liberation theology in the black church, because we're on this subject. And we're looking at some of the ways in which this has been influenced through our theology, through our liberation agenda of the church, our gender roles that we've been given, that we've talked about, and how all of this has overshadowed the issues of sexism and gender-based violence. Sometimes when I go out and I do the speaking, I think of some of the secular music that we have, because it's our job to fix it. It's our job to make sure that things get right when we go and we talk to our pastors. Sometimes the question is, well, what did you do? And trying to convince someone that you did nothing is very difficult. I think about some of what, and I'm not quite saying that in the church this was intentionally done. I think it was done because pastors and African American leaders believed it was the right thing to do. But in the midst of that, things got swayed, that women begin to hear differently than what men hear. And so even when I look at the music of our secular institutions, what do we hear? When we talk about leaving our mate, or the issue of getting a divorce, or the issue of separating so that we can be well and protected, I like to refer to some of the songs that within our systems that we even look at. I love the song that men hear, and that is, there must be 50 ways to leave your lover. Just hop on the bus, Gus, make a new plan, Stan. No need to record it, Roy. Just listen to me, hop on the bus. Don't need to discuss much. Just drop off the keys and set yourself free. That's what men hear. They hear the empowerment, the ability to make choices, the ability to take care of themselves. But women, what do we hear? We hear songs like, I have to fix this, I have to keep on going. What's one of these songs that I truly love? What you won't do for love. Remember that song? What you won't do for love. You try everything, but you don't give up. And we be swaying our heads and back and forth and doing all of that, but what it's telling you, you don't give up. While the men are hearing, hop on the bus, Gus. You don't need to discuss much. And so we have to be very careful within our theologies, within our liberation agenda, within ways that gender has been constructed, to begin to look at the language and how it's being parsed out to men and how it's being parsed out to women and how it disempowers women. I was so excited years ago when I heard the song Go Away Little Boy, because it was a song that seemed to be empowering women. It was by a black woman. It's Go Away Little Boy. I ain't supposed to be sitting up here in the dark with 2 mirrors and no money and no you. I recognize the fact that your lips, oh so sweet, don't look like our lips ever going to get another chance to meet. So go on away, little boy. And it was an empowering song. And I'm like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Gain your power. Be able to take that respite when you need it. Be able to move out of relationships. But then later on in the song, to my disappointment, she says, oh, don't kiss my earlobes like this. Oh, don't whisper in my ear like this. And then she goes on to say, do you think you're going to get a job by Monday? And then she says, well, you might as well stay, boy. And then what made that even worse the song even worse for me is at the end of it, she said, as the song is fading out, this time I'm going to be sweeter. So even in the last piece of this song that was already fading away from the empowerment of women, she began to take the blame. She began to take the shame that we put on women in our churches and in our society and the obligation to fix it. I'm going to be sweeter. And so that is the ways in which we have to begin to think about this whole gender entrapment as it relates to domestic violence. We have to understand how we're doing this within our church, how we're doing this within our family systems, how we're doing this within the general culture, whether it's with our preaching, whether it's with our doctrines, whether it's with our music. We have to be always aware of how this is happening. And so let's go to the next slide. So then as we think about this more, how do we begin to break the gender entrapment of African American women? In my book, as I talk about this issue, I mentioned the editors, Gloria Huss and Patricia Vail, and they were writing on the subject, all the women are white and all the blacks are men. And that is kind of how it has gotten within our culture, that when we're talking about black oppression, we're talking about black males. When we talk about women's issues, we're talking about white women. And so what has happened in the midst of that is that we have kind of, as women, built this subculture, a way in which we can feel protected, a way in which we can guide it, and we're not really black and we're really female. We have this culture that has not been attended to, that has not been addressed in significant ways to begin to look at these issues of sexual and domestic violence, especially as it relates to the issue of gender entrapment. And so my assertion at the beginning of this conversation was that African American liberation theologies can be used as a basis to develop strategies to break the gender entrapment of African American battered women. And so throughout the decades, African American liberation discourse began to increase our understanding and began to raise our consciousness, and we really have womanist theology to thank for raising concerns about women and also raising concerns about families, for beginning to redefine what it would look like within families, and talk about, even though we don't want families separated, that we can separate for the sense of health and healing, that we should be included in that conversation. And so breaking the gender entrapment of African American battered women requires these next couple of sets that I'm going to show you, but I'll stay on this slide for a minute. And some of these may overlap because this is the work that has to be done, and I try to put up a slide that's going to help us to begin to talk about this even more and see how we can begin to break this gender entrapment. And so part of that breaking the gender entrapment is that we need to make the connections between the history of oppression and violence against women. That is paramount in anything that I say. The stories have to connect. And then when we do that, we have to begin to develop models of ministry and intervention that addresses these interlocking systems of oppression. And so on one hand, we have the whole issue of violence against women. We have the power and control will. We have the definition of domestic violence, and all of that is necessary. If you don't know that, then it's not easy to go into this part that I'm talking about right now. We need to understand power and control. We need to understand tactics that abuses are used. But also when we go specific within the African American community, we have to make the other connections also. And so then we have to begin to look at the connections that we have in our educational system, our prison industrial complex, affordable wages. We have to go back and look at scripture and look at scriptures that we have once talked about that disempowered women, and find ways in which now we can use Scripture to empower women. It seems that over the years when we've talked about issues of Scripture, that we privilege some Scriptures. Example is we talk about in Scripture that God hates divorce. And we privilege God hates divorce, but we don't privilege God hates violence. And so my question that I have gotten over the years from Dr. Frank Thomas, that used to pastor New Faith Baptist Church, is to what end and to what purpose do we privilege some parts of our Scriptures and we don't privilege the other? And so we end up telling half-truths. Women should be silent. And so when the Scriptures are men are the head of the household, Scriptures, but it doesn't talk about the whole issue that it starts from a place of mutuality. And so we have to ask the question why. If we never ask the question why are these things happening, we will never get the opportunity to begin to develop the kinds of models that looks at all of our interlocking systems of oppression to begin to say, how now do I need to specifically model this so that it can really benefit the African American community, both male and female within that community, in the ways in which we've been structured. To give you an example of that, I might talk about it later, but why it's coming to my mind, the way that we've been gendered. Not only did African American women have their roles, but African American also had theirs. They are the bread owners. I think Dr. Hopkins talks about that in one of his Black Theology books, that black men have adopted all the genders of white America, yet they're not empowered to reach those agendas. And so what happens when you cannot reach that agenda? There's violence in the homes. It kind of goes back. And so we've been given these crazy roles that we need to begin to look at. And as the term says, we need to deconstruct that, and we need to reconstruct that. What does masculinity really mean? What does femininity really mean? What is going on in our system that we have to still experience internalized racism, where we still on the conversations of not liking ourselves and not liking our colors? How does that fit in to our sense of self-worth and our sense of what we deserve within healthy relationships? And we have to watch victim-perpetrator language. One of the things that I discovered in the midst of this work is that when you say victim to African American men, they're like, oh, well, what you mean victim? I'm victim too. And that is so true, because when you look at the issues that we think about when we talk about racism, there's victimization and all of the oppression that has happened. And so when we're using the words victim, it kind of takes away from what we really need to do to begin to think about how do we stop this violence, intimate partner violence within African American communities. Sometimes the language of victim and perpetrator is not helpful, rather than trying to figure out how do we get together to fix some of these things that has happened in our society. You can go to the next one. And so I put inclusive language in here also, because I know many times in the African American communities, in the African American church, we resist the use of God. But some of the, in many churches we don't want to talk about it, but when we talk about God as He, it leaves out women who have experienced this parent of God as He, as something that's not helpful for them in their healing process. And we exclude languages, and there are feminine languages for God within our biblical text. And we exclude the God is just God. And I know I'm Pentecostal through birth, and so we understood that God is He because Jesus is He, and is one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, so God is He. And so however you theologically and doctrinally understand God as He, I think we need to come to the realization that the language is not helpful for the healing and for the wholeness of women in general, African American women in particular, if we're going to begin to break this cycle. And that we need to find more inclusive language, language that's not exclusive He, as we look at how we can begin this healing process and to include women. And then we have to, I think this is really important, and that is add the conversation of domestic violence, of violence against women into the same dialogue as racism, and into the same dialogue with other systemic illness within the African American community. Remember when I started, I said that we have left that out. You know, that when we talked about racism and ills within our community, violence against women never came up. And so therefore, the models that we have developed did not help African American battered women. And so we have to include all of these things into, yes, I believe that racism is prima facie, that we have to look at all of these systems, but we also have to look at violence against women. And one of the ways that I can describe that in my book, I was reading the incidents in the lives of the slave girls, and I had to end up publishing some of these things in here because this was about a female slave named Linda Brent that was being terrorized by her slave owner who was white. And let me just read some of these excerpts from you. He told me that I was made for his use, made to obey his command in everything. My owner sought in every way to render me miserable. He did not resort to corporal punishment, but to all the petty tyrannical ways that human ingenuity could devise. At 15 years old, my master began to whisper foul words in my ear. He was a crafty man and resorted to many means to accomplish his purpose. Sometimes he had stormy, terrific ways that made his victims tremble. Sometimes he assumed gentleness that he thought must surely subdue. He told me that I was his property and that I must be subject to his will in all things. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny, but where could I turn for protection? Sometimes I expressed my contempt for him, and he would become violently enraged, and I wondered why he did not strike me. As a married man and a professional man, he deemed it necessary to save appearances to some degree. But the state of things grew worse and worse daily. I told him that I would seek help from my grandmother, and he threatened me with death, and worse than death if I made any complaint to her. She sought protection from Mrs. Flint, through indirectly exposing his infidelity. Miss Flint made it plain that his actions gained nothing through seeking the protection of my mistress. He stated the power was still in his own hands, and there was no place she could ever run for protection. I read this particular book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I read it when I was on the plane, and I read it, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. My eyes was a river. And I kept writing in the inserts of the book, DV for domestic violence, DV, DV. I finally had, years ago, made that connection that the same way that we got treated in slavery, it's that same way that we as African American people, but in this case African American men, when they torture and scorn African American women, were treated during slavery. What would happen if we could make that connection with African American men, that what they are doing is what was done to all of us in slavery, and that we have to stop. I am just so passionate. I'm so passionate about this because if we don't get that connection, I don't know if we can ever begin to fully be included in this struggle for liberation. You just cannot leave off 50% of the allies, that's the women, and think that we're going to solve this whole issue. We must begin to develop the kinds of resources that we need to effectively include issues of domestic violence in African American communities with the whole social and cultural context of racism that gave rise to the civil rights movement and African liberation theology in the first place. And we have to begin to talk about that. I was reading today, I shared it on my Facebook page, this whole article that came out about Moni Davis. She was the young 13-year-old who was featured in terms of the first female pitcher in these little leagues, and how all this attention she was getting in the midst of that. And she was called by a white baseball player a slut. And this guy was immediately taken off the team for which he served. And later on, Monique put a post asking to please forgive him, that he didn't mean what he done, that we all make mistakes, and asked him to reinstate him. And Dr. Brittany Cooper, who shared this quote on Facebook, said it all as best as I can even say it. This is her quote. She understood and loved the empathy, and she thought it was remarkable, but not particularly surprising. She goes on to say, black girls learn almost from the womb to empathize with others, even when the others have committed deep injustices toward us. Perhaps it is the unparalleled level of suffering that makes us always Lord with empathy upon others. This is another example for me of gender entrapment, our need as females to protect our disregard of what is going on within our own bodies and within our own emotional and mental psyche. That it's the gender entrapment that we have to do the work. The work is in our hands, the work is in my hands, and the work is in your hand, if you understand that, to begin to figure out other things that we can do to shift this whole cultural way of thinking, so that we in the long run can protect women. We can save African American families. We can begin to have understandings, as Dr. Lee Butler talks about, what it means to be in a loving home with one another. We can address some of the hidden agendas in African American male and female relationships, that sometimes there's a disdain for each other in our relationships that doesn't get talked about, that's rooted in some of these things that have happened. And so I just wanted to share this with you. I appreciate the time that you have given me. I want to give you time for questions, but I appreciate you being here. I know that all of this is in my book, along with a lot of samples, a lot of the examples and different ways in which you can read and understand this more. But the ultimate work of finding out what we need to do is in all of our hands. On this resource page, this is some resources. My book is pretty expensive because it was published as a research document. Battered African American Women, it was a research document. I think I have about 15 copies left that I could sell for $25. But if you go to the Mellon Press and ask for the paperback version, you might be able to get a cheaper copy. And faithtrustinstitute.org is where I work as a trainer. There I do a training for clergy healthy boundaries, about boundaries in the church with our pastors, and also domestic violence. This resource of Keeping the Faith, Guidance for Christian Women Facing Abuse, as long as God's Reconciling Love, a Pastor's Handbook, are just good things to keep around. Especially, I'm very familiar with Keeping the Faith because it's a handbook that we use. It has different questions that battered women tend to ask, and they give very good answers. It's just a small handbook that will at least get you started on ways that we can begin to construct and deconstruct passages in the Bible that have usually been used against women within the Bible. So I wanted to share these resources with you before we get to the questions and answers. Again, thank you, and it's just been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thank you, Sharon. That was really wonderful. Audience members, please feel free to submit your questions using the question box on the right side of your screen, and I will forward those on to Sharon. Sharon, one of the things I wanted to mention is that I've read your book, and it's incredibly readable and just very thorough, and you're a wonderful writer. There's a section, you talk a lot about liberation theology and womanist theology, and there's a section, page 196, First, we must acknowledge that new paradigms must be created that empower, heal, and transform our lives together that do not incorporate Western ideological or theological frameworks that serve patriarchy. Rather, a new paradigm must be created that calls for mutuality, communality, responsibility, and accountability. I would like to suggest that theological discourse consider a paradigm that has as its foundation a love ethic as a starting point for investigation. I was wondering if you'd speak a little bit about that idea of a love ethic.
Well, I think that if we're rooted in love, then we will understand that we should do no harm, and not so much on a punitive effort that people have to be punished for what they've done. There's been a lot of accountability issues, but the only accountability issue that we've had that has really had any kind of impact was the criminal justice system. And in the midst of that, African American families suffered in the midst of that. And we in the church have a unique opportunity to really begin to start from the love ethic. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about it quite often, that if we base things on our love and our care for people as human beings, then if we start with that as our starting point, that we all have value, whether we're black or white or same-gender loving or heterosexual, that we are all made in the image of God, and that we are worthy of being loved. We deserve to be loved. We deserve to be made whole. And all of those are rooted in love ethics, and not in ethics that calls for retribution, that calls for someone to be criminalized. It's an ethic that we have unique to us in the church that we can use also to begin to develop paradigms. Is that helpful, Sarah?
Absolutely. One of the things that you talk about is Jesus' parting words were intentional and radical, and they give us call to action. Jesus said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And I think that that's very profound and speaks to what you're saying. You mentioned the privileging of Scripture and how Scripture has been used to disempower women. I wonder if there are some common examples that you can talk about that people might encounter and ways that they can respond within their faith community.
Some examples? Are you saying some examples of Scripture?
Yeah, that have been used to disempower women that you run across kind of on a regular basis.
It's interesting because I've been looking at lately the preachers of Detroit on television, and the whole issue has come up on that picture of what I've seen over the years, and that is that women's places within the church. And I think it goes from women should be silent, women should not be over men, and the ways in which women who are pastors' wives, even on that particular show, and they don't self-describe as that, but in ways in which they don't see themselves any more than just a support of a husband, that they have no identity outside of supporting their husband, caring for their husband, and all those are wonderful, but they don't see themselves in ways of having their own power. And so we have taken Scripture within our church and not empowered women to be who God has called them to be, but have made them subservient to men. And God has made us both male and female and equal.
Thank you for that. So we're getting towards the end of our hour. I wonder if you have any final words or final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience.
I just want to thank everyone again for being here, and to help us to understand that this is a work in process. I am happy to receive any feedback and any thoughts around this issue as I continue to write, as I continue to research, because in the Bible, in Proverbs, it says that out of a multitude of counsel comes wisdom. and I love the counsel and the critique of others, so that we together can sit and discern what is that good and that perfect will of God, not somewhere in a corner by ourselves, but together as we grapple with difficult issues, with sensitive issues, with theological and doctrinal issues. I am one that needs an environment where we can have tough conversations and not just pat answers to anything. And I just encourage all of us to be open to that, so that we can discern how we can make this world safe for everyone.
You know, Sharon, I have one quick question that I am glad that got in before we ended. I know this is a question that's close to your heart as well. In the study of gender entrapment, how do you address gender empowerment of females with male children?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, she's asking how do you talk about empowering women who have male children? So I know that in your book you talked about your son and some of the things that he had experienced. So I think she's not exactly sure, but I think she's wondering, how do you talk about gender empowerment for women when they have male children in their families, when I think it's more about the construction of a healthy family and empowering boys as well.
Yes, I think that it's all about the construction of healthy families. There shouldn't be anything different that we tell our boys and our girls, because we're starting from the place of equality, from the humanness of people. I think that our culture will shift as we understand that these gender roles that we have for each other, our sons and our daughters, are not healthy for our communities. To ensure that when we're raising our children, that there's not men's chores and women's chores, even though are things that we might want our children to do simply because of their strength, to take it away all of these agendas and gendering, that women cannot do that, that men cannot do that because they are men, and women can't do that because they are women. That we have to find, we really literally have to begin to change our culture and begin to understand, change our understanding of how we have negotiated our ways together as families, and begin to look at ways that are more liberating and free for both male and female, because we're both caught up in this cycle, not just one. And we have to do that work of figuring out, how do we do that? How do we dispel the myths? And how do we begin to, if gender is a construction, then we can deconstruct that and begin to look at better ways in which we can live together as male and female.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So we're getting to the end of our hour, and I want to thank you, Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, for this presentation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you have any questions that you would like me to forward on to Sharon after this presentation, please just email those to me. You'll get my email address later this afternoon. And we want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. When you exit the webinar in a few moments, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey. If you would just take a moment and do that, give us your feedback about today's presentation, ideas for future presentations, we would be most appreciative. You can also find out about future webinars at our website, faithtrustinstitute.org. Excuse me. This concludes today's presentation. I want to thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.